course of this series on A Way to God for today, I have talked to you about peace and joy and silence and life and freedom. I have kept the most rewarding and possibly the most difficult topic for the end. Today I want to talk to you about love. I said it is possibly the most difficult topic because love is something that is so vast, it's almost like God Himself in its vastness and its mystery. We human beings sort of get a glimpse into love now and then. We understand it dimly, but I don't think anyone really comprehends this mysterious thing that we call love. What I am going to do in the program now is dwell on just two aspects of love, and I call them the aspect of love as creation and love as identification. Let me talk about love as creation, and I'll illustrate what I mean by that by means of a lovely American Indian tale. It's one of my favorites. There is this Indian warrior who finds the egg of an eagle on a mountain top, and then he places that egg with the other eggs that were being hatched by a hen. And in due course, the little chickens came out, they were hatched, and the little eaglet was hatched too. And the little eaglet grew up surrounded by these chickens, and after a while he learned to cluck like the chickens, he learned to scratch and claw at the earth and peck for worms, and he would flap his wings and just manage to get onto one of those low-lying branches, just like the other chickens. And all his life he lived with the consciousness that he was a chicken. Now one day, when this eagle had grown old, he happened to look up into the sky, and he saw a magnificent sight. There in the clear blue sky was a majestic bird, gliding where the strong currents of winds blew without the slightest discernible effort. The old eagle was impressed, and he turned to the chicken next to him and said, "Who's that?" And the chicken looked up and said, "Oh, that's the golden eagle, the king of the birds. But don't give it another thought. You and I are not like that." And so the old eagle never gave it another thought, and he died with the consciousness that he was a chicken, because that is the way everybody had treated him, and that is the way he grew up. You know what love as creation means? It means to look at that eagle and give him the consciousness of who he truly is, so that he would spread his wings and become a golden eagle. And in doing that, you create the eagle in him. There is a famous American psychologist who, together with a team some years ago, conducted a very interesting experiment in a high school here in the United States. You know what he did? He gave all the children in a high school an IQ test. Now, this was just before promotion, before the kids went on to the next class. Now, those IQ tests were given to the teachers, but not quite. These psychologists picked 10 or 12 names, and they said to every one of the teachers, "These 10 children will be coming into your class. You know, from the tests, it is clear that they are what is technically known as spurters. So you can expect them to spurt ahead in the course of the next academic year. Only you must promise never to say this to the children because it might do them damage. And the children and the teachers promised they would not say this to the children. The fact is that there was no such technical word as spurter, and that the experimenters had just taken any 10 or 12 names at random and given them to the teachers. Well, after a year, they came back to the school and they tested all the children again. And what do you think had happened? Every one of those spurters had increased his or her IQ by a minimum of 12 points. Some had increased it by as much as 36 points. The experimenters interviewed the teachers. They said, you know, what did you think of these kids? And the teachers, interestingly enough, were using adjectives like curious, affectionate, lively, interested, etc. for these kids. What would have happened to those kids if the teachers had not felt, rightly or wrongly, that they had budding geniuses in their classrooms? Were those qualities really in the kids? They evidently were. But you know, those teachers drew them out. Later, this psychologist tried the same experiment in other schools. They even tried it with animals, and always with success. You know, they would tell some psychology students who would be experimenting with rats, they'd say, we're going to give you a new breed of rats that will perform better. And what do you know? Those rats were performing better, though they were the same breed. And they found out that it was because the students were treating them with more respect or something. They were expecting this from the rats, and the rats were living up to their expectations. It was somehow communicated even to the animals. You know, when I first heard of that experiment, I thought of a great, great American whom some of you may still remember, Father Flanagan, who founded Boys Town. The man became a legend even in my country many years ago. He founded this place to help homeless boys in the beginning, but then later on he would help delinquent boys. And when the police would fail and everybody else would fail and they wouldn't know what to do with children, Flanagan would take them in. And the legend said that he never failed with these kids. I remember one interesting story that impressed me immensely. There was this 8-year-old boy who had murdered both his parents. Can you think what must have happened to that kid that he would have become violent at that young age? And he had been arrested again and again in armed bank robberies. The police did not know what to do with him because he was a minor. They couldn't take him to court. They couldn't send him to jail. They couldn't even send him to reformatory school because he had to be at least 12 years old for that. So in sheer desperation, they called Flanagan. They said, would you take this kid? And Flanagan said, sure, send him along. Now the boy, many years later, wrote his story. He said, I remember the day I was traveling to Boys Town in that train with a policeman, and I was thinking, they're sending me to a priest. If that man tells me that he loves me, I'll kill him. And you know, the boy was a killer. Well, what happened? He went to Boys Town, and the scene went something like this. There was a knock at the door, and Flanagan said, come in. And the boy walked in, and Flanagan says, well, whom do we have here? Dave, sir. Oh, yes, of course, Dave. Welcome to Boys Town. We were expecting you. Now that you're here, you will want to look around, and, you know, everybody here works for his living. Henry here will show you around, and then maybe you could choose an occupation, but take your time. Look around the place. That was all. I'll see you. Great. That was all. Nothing more. And the boy said that those few seconds changed his life. You know why? Because he said, for the first time in my life, I looked into the eyes of a man who, without using the words, was saying, not I love you. He was saying, you're good. You're not bad. You're good. And you know, the boy became good because, as psychologists tell us, we tend to become what we feel we are. Can you think of anything more spiritual and more divine than that? That we see goodness in someone and we communicate that to the person. And as a result, the person is transformed. The person is created. And that is the reason why it is said that the lover creates his beloved. He sees beauty there, and in the seeing, he draws it out. Well, people frequently asked Flanagan what the secret of his success was. And Flanagan would always brush it aside, but he had a motto, and the motto was, there is no such thing as a bad boy. See, Flanagan saw goodness there, and he drew that goodness out. He created it. And that is what I want to propose to you as love. One aspect of love, but a very beautiful and a very deep aspect of this thing that we call love. Well, would you like to get something of this charism that Flanagan had? I'm pretty sure there's not one of you who is listening to me who wouldn't want to share it, because we all want to love, don't we? If you want to develop that kind of charism, then you have to go to a school of love, and you will have to do some not difficult but not too easy exercises, spiritual exercises, which I am going to propose to you right now. Try them out later when you have the time, or at the end of this program. Try them out. What are these exercises? They're somewhat graded. You don't really have to follow the grading, but it would help if you did. Begin in the following fashion. Think of somebody whom you love. You love deeply, let's say. Imagine that that person is sitting there in front of you, and talk to that person. Talk lovingly. Tell that person what he or she means to you, what it has meant to you and to your life that this person came into your life. And as you do this, be in touch with what you're feeling. Then when you're all warm and aglow from this exercise, move on to the next one, the next step. Think of somebody whom you don't like, you don't particularly like. And you're standing there in front of this person, and as you are looking at that person, try to see something good in the person, to make allowances, to understand, and even to see goodness and good qualities there. If you find it hard to do this, then imagine that Jesus is standing there beside you, and he is looking at that person. Then he would become your teacher in the art of love, in the art of looking. What does he see there? What goodness, what beauty can he detect in that person? Incidentally, if Jesus were to come to earth again, what do you think is the first thing that he would notice in humanity? What do you think? You know what my guess is? I think the first thing that he would notice would be the immense amount of goodness, of trust, of sincerity, of sheer lovingness, to invent a word, that invades the whole of humanity. There are oceans of this among human beings, and he would notice it immediately, because the good person notices goodness everywhere, and the person who is evil notices evil, because we tend to see in others, don't we, a reflection of ourselves. So you have Jesus here looking at this person. What does he see in him or her? And then if you can get yourself in imagination to say this to that person, you're already taking a step forward to seeing and creating by seeing. Having done that, you come to the third exercise. And some of you will probably find this one the most difficult of all. But don't shirk it. If you really want to become loving, you have to go through with it. And what does it consist of? You imagine that you have Jesus right there in front of you. And he talks to you. And he tells you all the goodness and the beauty and the lovely qualities that he sees in you. Now, if you are anything like what I am and like what most human beings are, you will probably shrink from that. You will immediately begin to accuse yourself of all kinds of defects and sins. And Jesus will accept that. Because, you know, Jesus was no starry-eyed romanticist. When he saw evil, he called it by its name and he condemned it. But he would never condemn the sinner, though he condemned the sin. Think how he would look at a prostitute. You find it in the pages of the Gospels. How he would look at a thief, at a hardened publican, even at the Pharisees and the people who were crucifying him. Well, here he is then standing in front of you, and you accuse yourself of all of these sins, and he accepts them, and he admits that you do have all of those defects. But he understands. He makes allowances. And you notice an extraordinary thing. Those defects don't come in the way of his seeing goodness and beauty in you. That's not difficult to understand. Think of yourself. Think of someone whom you love. If you really look at that person, he or she has defects, isn't it? And yet those defects don't come in the way of your really loving the person and seeing goodness in that person. So imagine that Jesus is doing this and see what effect that has on you. That is vitally important if you are going to be able to do the same for others, that you accept this from him and from those who love you. When Jesus first met Simon Peter, the Gospels tell us, Simon, the fearful, the impulsive, he saw in that man something that no one would have suspected was there. And he nicknamed him the Rock. And that is what Peter became. Well, here is a variation of that exercise. Imagine that Jesus is standing right there in front of you. What name or what names does he invent for you? Before I move on to the next point, the next aspect of love, I want to recount here a lovely fairy tale that you have in the West. You know these fairy tales? They contain a great deal of wisdom. This is the tale of the princess and the frog. There is this charming princess who goes for a walk in the woods one day and meets with this frog. And the frog greets her very courteously. And the princess is amazed that the frog would speak human language. But then the frog says, "Your Royal Highness, I'm not a frog really, I'm a prince. But a wicked fairy cast a spell on me and turned me into a frog." And the princess, being a soft-hearted person, felt very bad about that. She said, "Isn't there something that can be done to break the spell?" "Oh yes," said the frog. The fairy said that if I would find a princess who would love me and keep me with her 3 days and 3 nights, the spell would be broken and I would become a prince again. Well, the princess already saw the prince there in that frog. So she took the frog back home with her to the palace. And everyone said, "What's this loathsome creature you have brought with you?" But she said, "Oh no, it isn't a loathsome creature, it's a prince." And being a strong-willed girl, she kept the frog with her day and night, there at the table, sitting on her pillow while she slept. And after 3 days and 3 nights, she wakes up to find this handsome young prince who kisses her hand in gratitude for having broken the spell and turned him into a prince. You know, that fairy tale is the story of all of us. Somehow we have been turned into frogs, and we go through life looking for someone who will break the spell and create us. Is your Jesus like that? Is he as good as Flanagan? Is your God like that? You remember I told you in that first program that God is unknown, but when we make an image out of him, is he at least as good as the best of us? When you walk in, does your God say, "Angels, trumpets, here comes the prince, here comes the princess"? Is that the way he treats you? Even while he sees all of your defects. You may want to ponder on this, because you know we tend to become like the God whom we adore. Let's get on to the next aspect of love. Love as identification. In my country, in India, the mystics and the poets have asked this question again and again: who is the holy person? And they come up with some beautiful answers. They say the holy person is like a rose. Is it possible for a rose to say, "I will give my fragrance only to good people who smell me, and I will withhold my fragrance from evil people"? Not possible. That's not in the nature of the rose. And the holy person is like a lamp lit in a dark room. Can a lamp say, "I will give my light only to the good people in this room and withhold my light from the bad people"? And the holy person is like a tree that gives its shade to good people and bad people alike. And the poet Tulsidas says, the tree will give its shade even to the man who is chopping it down, and if it is a sweet-smelling tree, it will leave its scent on the axe. Now, isn't that exactly like what Jesus tells us when he tells us that we must be all compassionate as our Heavenly Father is, who makes his rain to fall on good and bad alike, and who makes his sun to shine on saints and sinners alike? How would we ever get to this kind of love? By realization, by a mystical realization or experience. What does that mean? You remember how when I was talking about silence in that very first program, I told you that God is something like a dancer and the whole of creation is a dance, and that the dancer and the dance are not two. They're not one, but they're not two. Well, if you ever got the experience that you and the people around you are not two, not one, but not two. You know, something like we Christians say, God is three persons and one God. So we are millions of persons and one Christ. You know the way St. Paul puts it, don't you know we are all one body, members of one another? That image of the body, like my body and I, we're really not two. We're not the same thing. I am not my body, but we're not two. And how much I love my body, even though that love which I feel for my body isn't a feeling at all. But whether a member of my body, a limb of my body is diseased or healthy, I love it just as much. So here it is, this realization that some lucky people are given, that they are different from others, but not separate. They're one body. You know, we have an interesting tale in India of 7 crazy men who go to a neighboring village for a kind of a big banquet, and they come home late at night drunk and crazy as they were before. So it begins to rain, and they all take shelter under a tree. And the next morning they wake up, and there is loud lamentation. And a passerby stops there and says, "What's going on?" And they say, "Well, we huddled under this tree, and our limbs got all mixed up, our legs and our hands, so we don't know whose legs and whose hands belong to whom." So the passerby said, "Well, that's easy. Give me a pin." Then he pricked one leg, and the owner said, "Ouch!" And the man says, "That's your leg." And so he went on, pricking different hands and legs and separating them. You know, when someone is hurt or someone is badly treated, and I say, "Ouch," something has happened. Love as identification, as not to. Can we do anything to get this grace? No, no. It is a gift. What all that we can do is prepare ourselves. How? You're going to find this hard to believe now, but you remember how I told you in that very first program that if we would sit and look, or we would sit and get in touch with ourselves, when I spoke about peace, we would come to a silence and things would be revealed to us. Well, all you can do is prepare the ground. And if you have been practicing this exercise, which I have really been recommending in almost every one of these programs, of sitting, of looking, of getting into the present, you are preparing yourself beautifully for this grace. Someday, hopefully, it may be given to you. So let me summarize what I have said then in this program. I gave you a somewhat lengthy series of exercises to practice, which will give you, let's put it this way, short-term results, fairly quick results, because you will notice the difference. And then I have given you this other exercise, hopefully that would bring you love as identification. That would be a somewhat long-term result that God may give to you. In the first series of exercises, you will become loving. With this other exercise, you may become love. Christianity tells us that God is unknown. He is the mystery. And Christianity also makes an outstanding statement, which we find in the Bible, that God is love. Think of God, the unknown, not just as a noun. Could we think of him also as a verb, so that we could say, when you are loving, you are Godding? Could we think of God not just as a person, but as an activity, so that when you are loving, you are Godding? You are charged with divinity and with God and with grace. Well, this series of programs has been called A Way to God for Today. Can you think, in this world that is torn by conflicts, suspicions, hatreds, wars, can you think of a better way to God for today than this one?